Redux Devtools is awesome. While you're working on an app at any time, you can open up your DevTools and see how the state of your application has been changing over time. But you know what else would be really cool? Is if you could see the selectors. I've always wanted this ever since I started using Redux, because so much of your logic is in selectors, but they're kind of these opaque things that you can't inspect. So I thought it'd be really cool if I could get selectors inside DevTools. So generally it's bad practice to put derived state in the store, but this isn't in the store. These are just selectors that are outside the store, and they're showing up in DevTools using the state sanitizer. So it's just Redux Devtools. So this video is about explaining how I got there. It first started with a different problem because the syntax for selectors has always bugged me. It's very long. Look at this. You have the selector here, function create selector, the input selectors, and then finally doing the calculation. If we didn't need that memoization, all we would need to do in React is this. Just say, here's the thing, do the calculation with the input things. Okay, so this is really annoying because basically a performance consideration is causing our code to become really, really big and the syntax really fluffy. And boilerplate obscures business logic. This is what matters right here. And you have to, imagine a big file like this, you have to just scan through that and find the actual things that you care about. So I really didn't like this syntax, so I wanted to come up with something new. I did come up with a new syntax, and this is what it did to some selectors I had. On the left, it's the traditional create selector function, and in this case from reselect. And on the right hand side, it's the new syntax I came up with. It's a lot cleaner, more minimal, and the focus is on the business logic instead of the boilerplate. So I'm going to explain how I got here and how I accidentally stumbled onto the possibility of putting selectors in Redux Devtools. When I started, I asked myself what syntax would be ideal. What would I really want to have my selectors look like? And what I really just want is that function itself, the business logic, and none of the boilerplate. But you can't just do that, or else it's not going to be like, it's not a function. It's not going to be reactive unless you're inside React, and in that case, it's not going to be performant. So what I wanted to do is for you to be able to interact with previously defined selectors as if they were state instead of functions for getting state. So, and then I could attach functionality when you're accessing those selectors behind the scenes to actually call those selectors and take care of memoization. So basically what I wanted was a proxy object, because that lets you define extra behavior on top of everything. But in order to get it to be typed correctly, I had to define all the selectors in one object that would be the proxy object. And then once they're defined, you get an object that's typed correctly that has all the selectors on it. And the way I came up with was basically like a builder type pattern, sort of like this. So maybe build selectors, and then you'd start with top level selectors that would just take in the state object and define a selector. And then, each time you call this builder, it would allow you to define new selectors using the previously defined selectors. So this would all be for one shape of state, in this case just a string. And so it'd be sort of like internal selectors derived state from that one object or type or whatever. This is the actual syntax I ended up with, because having all your selectors defined as part of one object reminded me of the well, I actually already knew this was the direction it was going to go because I love state adapters, but like the entity adapter that was introduced by NgRx entity and then later brought back over into Redux toolkit. it had a cool pattern where it defined a bunch of functionality for a specific state shape, and then you can reuse that everywhere. So I have a state management library called StateAdapt that's kind of based on that idea. And so creating this selector syntax is for StateAdapt. That's what I originally was doing this for. And yeah, so what I came up with was a builder for state adapters. So you can build selectors together like this. And there are a lot of parentheses here. Sorry about that. The reason is because this is where you would define the original like state adapter, and then you keep calling it to do like a higher order, like selectors using the original state adapter. But that's probably not, and whatever. It is what it has to be. So I thought about it, and that's how it's going to stay, I think. So, right. So there are a couple of weird things about this that you should know about. First is that I don't name my selectors get or select something. This was a convention I borrowed from NgRx. It really makes it nice to refer to selectors as nouns because what you're really after is the state. And when I define these selectors, I'm treating them as the state itself and not as functions. So it makes sense to name them nouns or adjectives, whatever it is, instead of like the get whatever verb. So that's the first thing. The other thing is this S variable. What does that represent? Well, this is the proxy object. And when you access a selector on it, it's going to add some behavior behind the scenes and memoization and stuff. So what I wanted was to come up with a name for this that made sense, but I couldn't think of anything because it's not really state, because it's not state. It's referring to selectors, but it's not really referring to selectors too. It's more like selector state, but selectors don't have state really. They have like memoized values, but I couldn't really come up with some name that made sense, and it doesn't really matter at all anyway. It's just basically a container for your selectors, so I doubt anyone's going to complain. I mean, feel free to if you want to make me wrong, but there's no issue. I have no issue with just calling it S. It's just serving as the container of your selector state stuff. And so it basically, in my mind, it means both selectors and state. I'm not sure which, but it's just the object where your selectors are available on it. Okay. So those are the two weird things to know about this. But there's another issue, and that is reusability. This is what state adapters are really for. And if you remember how to do this with NgRx or Redux, you have to, so basically you want to define a selector, but then you have two reducers that have similar state shape, and you want to be able to reuse a selector for them. But you can't define a selector because it's going to be memoized, by itself. If you call it for one state and then the other state, it's always going to be different, so it's never going to memoize properly. So what you want to do is create a specific memoized selector for each independent piece of state that you're going to use it on. So, so what you do is you create a selector creator. All right. So what you do is you define this function that returns a selector, but it takes in the state selector because that's what's different between the different instances of the selector. So when you get a specific selector for a specific piece of state, you can call the selector creator and then get the selector you actually want for that specific piece of state. And it will be dedicated to that thing and memoized correctly. So this syntax sucks though. I've always hated this. It's like to start on a feature and not realize that you need to do this, and then realize later that you need to reuse your selectors, you have to go back and change all of them. And the syntax is just really verbose. So I don't like it. And yeah, I really prefer this syntax. This does the same thing as this. Yeah, basically. In StateAdapt it does. With Redux, there's one extra step at the end that's similar to this step, but close enough. Anyway, so this is a lot better down here. And so how do I implement these selectors? Because this is what ended up leading to the ability to cache these things in a way that Redux Devtools could access. So what needs to happen when this function runs and these are defined? This function right here, this is the developer defined function, the selector function. And so this is going to be a proxy object. So what needs to happen is when they call this selector function, it needs to be able to detect that it's accessing the reverse selector and call the reverse selector itself with the state that's passed in, and then return that value. And if that value is the same, this is the memoization part, then you don't need to run this function, right? So it's actually pretty complicated, the implementation. It's a bunch of steps. Okay, so imagine you're calling it for the first time. There's no way to get around running this function because you don't know what input selectors are used in here. So you pass the proxy to this function, and then you listen to what properties it's accessing. If it accesses a selector, you add it to a set of input selectors, and then you return the value and you cache that value, and you do that for everything that's accessed. And then when the selector gets called again, you have a list of registered input selectors that were called the previous time, and you can check those results against the so you can call those functions again to get new results, check those against old results, and if they're the same, you don't need to run this function again. Okay, so that's the basic idea of how memoization works for this. And this actually comes with some really cool benefits. Imagine if you have like this selector right here, and it returns just the first one that's truthy. So thing one is going to maybe return something truthy the first time this is called. And if that happens, it's going to cache that. Then next time it's called, it's going to only have thing one as the thing that was registered, because these were never run. So these input selectors were never registered. So as far as the selector is concerned, this is the only value that matters so far. And so if it returns truthy again, it can just return the same value it returned last time this function ran. Okay? So the benefit of that is it is memoized, and it doesn't run these input selectors at all. So, but the other benefit is it allows you to not even run this whole function. Okay, so with reselect, you have input selectors. And when you call the main selector, it has to call each of those input selectors first, and then it checks those against previous values. And if any of them are different, it's going to run this function again. Okay, so even if the second and third inputs, even if they are irrelevant to the end result, it still has to call those functions to get the cache values, and to compare with the cache value and decide to run this function again. Okay, but with this syntax, you don't have to do that at all. With a proxy and with this lazy registration of selectors, these input selectors aren't going to run at all. And also, they're not going to trigger this main function to run. So if this never changes, these will never be called, and this will never run again. So that's cool. Two extra optimizations with this neat proxy syntax. Yeah, proxies are pretty cool. But I had a problem with this. And let's see if we can see what the problem is. This is the initial implementation. And what I did is I had these objects here So when you create, or when you call this function, I called it combine selectors. You do this for every single step in that builder chain. You have existing selectors, and then you have the return types of those selectors, and then you have the new selectors that are being defined. So how are you going to manage the cached values? I defined some objects here to store them on. And so as it's running through the logic, it's going through the inputs, doing the logic I explained earlier, it's storing all these cached results in these objects here. And you may have thought of a problem, or maybe not, because it took me a long time to think of this, and it probably shouldn't have. But there's a problem with reusability here. Because these selectors, there's only one of these defined per adapter, right? Every time you create a selector for the adapter, it's the selector for that adapter. And it's using these cached values. So if you use that adapter on two different pieces of state, they're not going to be cached independently. That one function was created with this closure, with these cache objects. So yeah, that was a problem. The first solution I thought of was to change these blocks from being, objects to arrow functions that return objects with all those new selectors. But this collided with syntax I already had for something else. And so I ended up not going with this at all. But this would have allowed me to lazily define these selectors at the moment you choose a piece of state for the selector to manage, or the adapter to manage. So it would run through all the selector blocks and call them, define them lazily at that moment. So I thought maybe I should have adapter creators, sort of like selector creators. I really didn't like this, but this is a problem I needed to solve. So I tried this, I thought about it, ended up not going with it. But the idea is that instead of defining just the plain adapter, you define a function that returns the adapter. So each different state would get technically a different adapter, but the naming would get confusing. Like, what would you call this? Create string adapter instead of just string adapter? That was annoying. So I didn't end up going with that. Plus, it has this like prettier would always format out like this nested syntax, and then VS Code was annoying. You hit enter and it stays there. I really hate that. It stays indented. So it's extra syntax. Same with the thing above. So I hated this. This was annoying figuring this out. So I thought maybe this is when I was thinking really hard. I got to this solution. This is second place. This was the one I liked the most. It was basically you define it the exact same way, except instead of defining your selector as this one function, you define it as a function that returns this selector function. So all these are just ways of lazily defining a specific selector function that has a specific closure that's independently memoized from all the other instances of state that you might be interested in managing. So this was the nice thing about this is the syntax is mostly the same, but the stupid thing about this is you'd have to type this arrow function on potentially dozens of selectors that you're defining. So that bothered me a lot too. And then I had an idea. What if I merged these two functions and had this selector take in a second parameter? Sometimes that's used for props for selectors, but I've never liked that pattern. I think NgRx may have removed that ability. But basically, with StateAdapt, it's so easy to put something in state that anything dynamic like an ID or a prop of some kind that you pass into a selector could just be state somewhere, and then you create a selector that combine those things. So you don't really need props with StateAdapt. And so I never supported it with StateAdapt. So what I ended up creating was a selector function that would take in, so it would be one function for all state for all state instances or whatever. But each of them, when they called it, they would pass in their own context. They would pass in a cache object as the second parameter of the function. So they're all calling the same function, but they own their own cache or context, whatever. And the selector just uses that, whatever it's given, to look for the input selector results and to store the current selector results and all that stuff. All right, and here's that implementation. So when you define a new selector, this is now just one function per selector, it takes in state and the cache. And it's going to store everything on this cache. So first thing it does is it checks if a cache was provided at all. If not, it just calls the function that the user defined as the selector and passes in a proxy because it still needs to be able to intelligently access those selectors. And this is actually a bug, this syntax right here. It should just be either target or selectors, probably target. And, they mean the same thing, but it's grabbing the selector they're looking for and passing in state. So they're accessing it as if it's a state, but actually it's a selector that you call as a function. And there's no need to pass in cache as the second object, so whatever. Okay, but if there is a cache provided, now we can get the cached inputs and return the cached result if the result of all the cached inputs are the same. So this is just details of accessing the cache values. And so another thing is if it's running for the first time, there are no registered input selectors, so you have to just recalculate anyway. But other than that, if it's, you just loop through the previously registered inputs and find out what their current values are. And if the value is the same as the current one for every one of them, then you set this all inputs results same. And if that's the same, you just return that cached result. Okay, but then when it comes to recalculation, this is pretty simple. You define a proxy, give it the selectors, and with the handler, when it's accessing a property, you register that as one of the cached inputs, and then you call that. Okay, well, we have to call the input, and actually these do their own caching, so I don't need to worry about if it's cached or not. I just call the function and pass it the cache. And if it has results on there already, then it uses them. If not, it does its own recalculation. That's its own concern. So anyway, I just call the function from here and then return that input value. And so when you're accessing this when you're accessing this right here, it's going to just return the value of calling the selector. So this is pretty cool. It made me realize, since we have this cache that belongs to a specific piece of state, and we're passing that to all the selectors, and they're all, caching their results on it, why couldn't we look inside that cache object whenever we want? Like we've got all these cached values in one place. That's like super convenient. And I thought, what can we do with this? And so what I ended up coming up with was a way to take that cache object and then sort of serialize it, because right now, so far, all the selectors are mutating it. So we'd serialize it into a neat, new structure. And then we would just, in our state sanitizer, when we're preparing our state shape for Redux Devtools, we can just take that cache object and then serialize it and dump it into our state to show up in Redux Devtools. So the question is, though, you got all these independent cache objects. How do you get them into one giant cache object to serialize in one place in the store? Well, here's what I have as the structure for the cache object. So when you create a selectors cache, this is usually unused. Just imagine this is like an empty object. That's the default thing. That's what it will be pretty much always. I don't think I'm ever going to use this, but anyway. So you create a selectors cache, and it's got 4 properties on it. It's got an ID, so unique ID for each cache object, and then results where it stores results of each selector, and then inputs. So each selector gets its own key under this, and that key, the corresponding value is another object with all the inputs and their values. And they've got children, and this is a recursive structure. So this right here, it refers to itself. So basically, when you have a reducer, you combine them and you create this tree of reducers, and it corresponds to a tree of states. And then at the very tip, you've got this root reducer, and that combines all of them. And so this mirrors that pattern. You have a selector cache for each reducer, and then in the parent reducer file, you import that cache to add it as a child of this of the upper reducer, or the parent reducer, whatever. That selectors cache. Okay, so with StateAdapt this works automatically, but how can we get this to work in NgRx and Redux? So you can import the state sanitizer from StateAdapt core, and however you do it with Redux, you just pass it in as the state sanitizer. Basically, and sometimes it might be typed wrong, so you need to know what it does. Basically, for StateAdapt, like everything is under an adapt property, or like an adapt reducer. And so what the state sanitizer used to do for StateAdapt before I did all this stuff was it would just take that adapt property and spread that result onto the main state object. But with Redux, you may not have a reducer called adapt, and if you do, it might like mess with the behavior. You probably don't. But anyway, TypeScript will complain with some of these implementations, because it knows the shape of your reducers. And so you can, like, if adapt is undefined, the spread operator doesn't complain. It will spread undefined and it will have no effect on the object. So it's fine, but TypeScript will complain. So you can either type it as any, or add an adapt reducer that does nothing, whatever. Or you can intercept it and figure out how to handle it. It's not too bad. I have a Redux toolkit project that I applied this to, and what I did was I defined a new state sanitizer. This is actually unnecessary, but this is how I did it. So I call the StateAdapt state sanitizer with the same state that originally gets passed in, but added this adapt object onto it. This made TypeScript happy, so yeah, if you just try to pass in this thing by itself, it'll complain because the adapt property is missing. Yeah. Anyway, so this is the main configuration. You also have the global cache object, and I may change how I do this. I mean, I have no problem with this at all. People get weird about attaching things to the global window object, but I don't have a problem with it. Like if you have a really specific key, why not? So that's what I'm doing here. With StateAdapt, the one that the state sanitizer is going to find is the one that I've defined inside the StateAdapt library. And so you need to access that thing that exists already, and you can import it directly, but I think knowing how to access it like this might give you more flexibility in case you want to redefine it. But basically, it's something that already exists, and you can import the selector cache key and use it to access the global selectors cache. Anyway, so you get the children, and then you can define whatever you want here. it makes sense to name this the same as your reducer name. So I'm importing the cart reducer and the cart cache from the cart feature. So these structures mirror each other, but in one you've got the cache, selectors cache, and the other you got the reducer. So let's look at the child feature now. Okay, so I've got this build adapter thing. So when you define your selectors with this, it's going to be a bunch of functions that take in cache objects as their second argument. In order to basically like instantiate it or get selectors that already know about a cache object for this specific feature, you first create that specific cache object. And so I've got this function, create selectors cache. I already showed it to you. And then you get new selectors. So build adapter returns an adapter. You access the selectors by accessing adapter.selectors. And that's the first argument of this function. It's called map to selectors with cache. Hopefully that's descriptive enough. Yeah, so the selectors that are generic are defined above, and then you pass in the state selector. So you start with state and it returns this feature. And then you pass in that cache object that you created for this, and you gotta export it and define it separately because you're using this in the parent file. So anyway, so this loops through each selector and defines a new object with new selector functions that implicitly pass this as the second parameter. And that works. I'll show you what that looks like with this specific app. So this is a Vite app I found on GitHub. I don't speak, is this Portuguese or Spanish? I think it's Spanish, but I could be wrong. Anyway, so it's like a shopping thing. Anyway, so if I go over here and let's, I hope it's automatically selecting the right store. Auto select. Okay, so we add products, calculate shipping. I don't know why shipping is a separate action. It should probably be a select. But anyway, you can see here that they show up under previous selectors. So, oh man, this is terrible. My face is blocking here. Hey, look at that. You can see it. Okay, so you got previous selectors. And so now you can observe the selectors. So you got total, that was this selector. And then you'll have total with shipping. And it's called previous selectors because when you're calling these selector functions, it's against the state that was already calculated. So by the time your new state gets into Redux Devtools, the selectors haven't been called yet. You have only the selectors that have been previously called. So that is the issue with that and why this is named previous selector. So it might get a little confusing because here you'll see shipping value went from 0 to 85, but that's actually the current action and the new state from it. What this is it's changing from, hang on. It's just changing because of the add product. So the state change on this one was that you added something with a price of 221. So in here, you'll see the selector go from 661 up by 221. Okay, so that's one confusing thing about this, but at least you got selectors in here. So that's awesome. I have another example in an article I wrote. I'm going to have a link to this article in the description for this video. So check that out, and I'll have a link to the repo that I was just showing you as well. So go ahead and look at that. But yeah, this is easier in StateAdapt. But yeah, there is a situation that doesn't work for reselect or Redux, but it does for StateAdapt. Well, so the selectors work. So it's when you're selecting from there you can see me. Okay, so it's when you have like two pieces of state and you're creating a selector that grabs two selectors from those states. So it's like it's like a cross store selector or cross reducer selector, cross state selector, whatever. So you can use these. These are the selectors that you created when you called this function. Where was it? Map. Yeah, map to selectors with cache. These are now full memoized selectors. You call it and you pass in the global state, and it will return the value memoized. And so you can directly access selectors from that with reselect, and these will function just like reselect selectors. Okay. The issue is since it's being defined with reselect, it's not going to show up in Redux Devtools unless you have some other way of getting selectors to show up in Redux Devtools with reselect. I did see some people were working on that like 3 years ago or something. But there were like open issues, and yeah, it didn't seem settled. I don't know. It kind of seemed like people dropped it. Anyway, but the way this works in StateAdapt is for each piece of state, you have a function called adapt, and you pass in the path that it will occupy in. Ooh, I need to change that to 2. That it will occupy in the global store, and then the initial state, and then the adapter that's going to manage that state. And automatically this will, like, selectors will be attached to this store object. And then if you want to select across both of these stores, you use this syntax. You join stores, and this is the same syntax as build adapter, except it prefixes each store selector with the property key that you define. So each selector from store 1 will be available as string 1 and then the selector with the first letter capitalized. So that's how you can access these, but the functionality is the same underneath. And the way it shows up in Redux Devtools is oh, this is from the other app. Okay. Make it come back here. All right. The way this shows up in Redux Devtools is the joined store selectors become children of both of the store selectors that it's using as inputs. So it uses the selector's cache ID, and uses that for the child. But they both get it. So if you're looking at filters, selectors, you can access how this is used further down. So filtered products, so you can see how filtered products changed for both. So yeah, let's do that again. Or that was actually the state change from the one before, but the selector was available one after. So if we do another quantity change, then we'll see another one of these. Yeah, it went from 2 to 3. That was referring to the last one. So up here, yeah, the product quantity change from 2 to 3. Yeah, so I'm pretty happy about this. And I had no idea when I had that bug with the like shared functions not being memoized correctly that eventually it would result in this, but this is really cool. I think it's really cool. I've always wanted selectors in Redux Devtools, so the fact that this accidentally happened is just really cool. So anyway, yeah, StateAdapt is a library that I created, and it's almost ready for production, I think. I've used it on like 30 projects now. I've been posting a bunch of YouTube videos about where I'm like converting various things to use StateAdapt, and it's helped me find some bugs, and it seems like it's getting to be more like picky bugs. You know, like this one is a performance one. It's a pretty major one, honestly, but I have tested pretty much everything with the library now on various projects, so I'm going to release 1.0 pretty soon. So give it a try if you're interested, and give the repo a star if you want. And I would really appreciate feedback. And yeah, try this in a Redux project and see how you like it. All right. Thanks.